Welcome. So glad to see so many familiar faces out there, and so glad we're going to have such a big crowd tonight. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm sure people will continue to flow in as time goes on. So I want to let you know before we get started that tonight's talk is going to be recorded, and we also request that you leave on your videos. And unless there's a problem with that, where you don't want to be on the recording, then shut it off. But if not, we would all really like to see everyone's faces. And we will have the chat function on as well. So throughout our presentation tonight, if you have questions, please either post them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom to raise your hand, because our speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment, is happy to take questions throughout her presentation. So if you have any questions for us or any technology problems, you can also post those in the chat. My name is Abby Ferber, and I'm director of the Matrix Center for the Advancement of Social Equity and Inclusion, and a professor of sociology and women's and ethnic studies at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And I want to begin by thanking some of our members of the Matrix Center team: Linda Smith, Jason Rogers, and Brittany Lowenberg, and professor of sociology, or professor of women's and ethnic studies, Trey Wentling, who is also going to be assisting us tonight. So it's taken a lot of work to get us here to this point, and Loretta Ross, our distinguished speaker, she and I have been corresponding over the past year, I think, to finally get this scheduled and planned and underway. So we are so excited to have her as our distinguished speaker tonight. And I want to thank the University of Colorado Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion grant program for helping to fund this evening's event. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about our speaker before I hand things over to her. And there is a lot I could say. I could talk for an hour about your work, but I'll just give a short introduction and then let her do the talking. So Loretta Ross is an author, educator, organizer, activist, public scholar, and was deservedly named a MacArthur Fellow in 2022. And you may have heard the language that's commonly used, a MacArthur Genius Award. And that really does honor and recognize the lifetime of work that she has contributed to all of our battles against oppression and inequity. Professor Ross's dedication began in 1978 when she began working at the country's first rape crisis center. This is where she first learned about women's rights, human rights, reproductive justice, white supremacy, and women of color organizing, the issues that she's remained true to ever since. Many people know Loretta Ross from her work with Sister Song Color Collective. And if you're not familiar with it, once this is over, go look it up right away. Go to their amazing website. It's an incredible, groundbreaking organization that shifted the entire dialogue around what's often referred to as pro-choice and pro-life debates, to instead look at deeper issues and reframe the discussion around what they called reproductive justice. Sister Song defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children they have in safe and sustainable communities. So you can see there already the way in which she's shifting the dialogue and the way in which Sister Song has to put individual rights within a social, cultural, and economic context, and to look at the ways in which centering different people's lives change the picture and change the issues. And by putting women of color and other marginalized groups in the center, it necessitates that we change the way in which we think about so many issues. Loretta Ross is currently a professor at Smith College, where she now is teaching a new course called Calling In, which focuses on call-out culture and white supremacy. And she has a book called Calling In, or let's see, it's called Calling In the Call-Out Culture, which will be published, I think, in the next year, maybe a matter of months. she could let us know. Great. And she has written so many other books you may be familiar with, maybe not. If not, go out there and get them because they're incredible. So she's co-edited or co-authored Women Who Changed the World, Stories from the Fight for Social Justice, Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice, Radical Reproductive Justice, Foundations, Theory, and Practices, and Reproductive Justice, an Introduction, a textbook designed to be used in courses. You might also be familiar with her from seeing her face on CNN, BET, Good Morning America, and so many other shows. And she's also been featured in news articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and many other respected sources. She is dedicated to sharing what she has experienced with emerging activists in hopes that you will join the transformative human rights movement that has changed the world and so many of our lives so far. And that's why she's here with us, contributing her time and knowledge and friendship with all of us here tonight. Thank you so much, Loretta. Well, now you can see everyone, so you can see people waving and clapping their hands and saying hello. So thank you so much. I turn things over to you.
Well, thank you. And I want to first apologize for a couple of things. The first thing I want to apologize is that it would have been my hope to do this presentation in person. And unfortunately, the travel logistics defeated our best efforts between my staff and Abby, and we just couldn't pull it off that way. So we arrived at this Hollywood Squares kind of thing we've all gotten entirely too used to since COVID. But this is the best we can offer, but it does allow bigger geographic reach. It actually allows people to participate who possibly couldn't have made it in person. So it has its advantages and disadvantages. The other thing I want to say is that I encourage people to interrupt me with your questions as opposed to piling them all up at the end. We're still going to leave a Q&A at the end, but I need to warn you that I do the world's worst PowerPoints. I mean, I'm like trying to put a whole dissertation on each page. And so that creates a very dense learning experience. And sometimes people need to slow me down and say, explain this word or explain what you mean by that. And so that's why I welcome a more dialogical process than the monologue of my just running my mouth. Though I am a professional talker, I can talk for hours and barely take a breath, you know, but let's hope that I don't get drawn that way tonight. And I will also add, in case people are concerned, that I volunteer to share my PowerPoint with Abby, so that if anybody wants it after this, she'll have my permission to share it and distribute it around, if that's okay with folks. So let's pretend I know what I'm doing. The problem is that we've all been doing Zoom, we who teach, for over 3 years, and we still mess it up most times. I know I still mess it up, but hopefully this will suffice. I need someone to tell me they can see that screen.
Yep, can see it.
Okay, we're good. Well, I did mess it up overall. My favorite course that I teach is called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. That is why I was hired at Smith College. Matter of fact, that's why I get hired at all my colleges. Because when I was asked to teach at Hampshire College, they asked me what I wanted to teach on, because they gave me an open book, a blank slate. They said, whatever you want. And I think they expected me to teach about reproductive justice, because that's what I'm best known for, as being one of the 12 Black women who created reproductive justice. But I spent most of the 1990s monitoring hate groups, and I was the only woman and the only Black person who headed up a research department at a group that monitored hate groups. It was called the Center for Democratic Renewal, formerly known as the National Anti-Klan Network. And it was in that work that I first got to meet Abby and read her amazing book, which I'll talk about more in a little while. But it took the eye of a Black feminist to notice the overlap between the organized white supremacist movement and the organized anti-abortion movement. And so I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit in my presentation. I'll be starting off by talking about, though, what my definition of white supremacy is that I'm teaching in my classes. And I started teaching it once I saw Donald Trump come down that golden escalator. And I figured that I was one of the few people, particularly the few Black feminists, who'd made a career studying hate groups. I spent a lot of time being the only Black person at Klan rallies and things like that. So I thought that's what I wanted to teach, and I'm so glad I did, because nobody could actually foresee, except those of us who studied white supremacy, what damage he would do to democracy. Because the white supremacist movement is an insurrectionist movement. They see themselves as revolutionaries. They do not see themselves as maintaining democracy so much as deconstructing it. Whoever's managing the IT, can you make sure you admit people quickly? Because it tends to obscure my screen. I'm gonna admit that person. But keep on top of it, because every time the admission happens, then my controls reappear and I have to hide them again. So why don't we start with Barbara Perry's quote? The vitriol of hate groups is not so much an aberration as it is a reaffirmation of the racist and gendered views that permeate society. The political rhetoric of hate does not fall on deaf ears. A lot of people who are not versed in understanding white supremacy think that it is something that is relatively recent or that it's over. They can't quite get it right which way they want to go on it. And particularly with the election of President Obama, people thought that it was passe now. We've come this far, we're not going to turn back. But of course, if you read any kind of analysis, you'll see that Donald Trump was elected because Obama was a Black president. And he was the backlash answer to white people feeling that they were losing the monopoly on power that they feel that they're entitled to. So what I'm going to do today is talk about my definition of white supremacy. How does it influence society, particularly how does it influence issues of gender and race in society? And then I'll close with talking about reproductive justice, for which Abby has given a wonderful basic definition. First, I want to start off by talking about what's happening post-Dobbs. The Dobbs decision, of course, that reversed Roe v. Wade. Tomorrow, there's going to be elections in places like Virginia and Ohio, where they are going to be deciding whether or not they can protect abortion rights within their states. But the Republicans have found out that they're losing at the polls. And in any kind of direct democracy campaign against abortion, they lose unless they do like they did in Ohio and obfuscate the language. But they are committed to maintaining and expanding state bans on abortion. Ever since Ronald Reagan was elected, they've been trying to get federal anti-abortion legislation passed. Reagan got elected promising to do a human life amendment to the Constitution. He never delivered on that. Actually, he never even tried to deliver on that because he knows that it takes, 2/3 of the states to agree to a constitutional convention. He couldn't deliver that. But still, making promises is sufficient for the base that he was trying to build by pulling together the people who were opposed to civil rights, the segregationists, the people who were opposed to women's rights, to LGBT rights, to immigrant rights, to environmental regulations, to corporate regulations. And that's what they formed, calling itself the moral majority in the late 1970s that brought Ronald Reagan to power. And of course, they're working to restrict birth control. They want money to go to extremist, lying crisis pregnancy centers, and they're trying to open up a national network of maternity homes. And we're like, well, wait a moment, didn't those homes for unwed mothers go out of fashion in the 1960s? Why are they coming back? And I'll be talking about that. Redefining birth control as abortion. And what's really dangerous for doctors is that they're now, because of the policies that they're implementing, there's going to be an inevitable increase in maternal and infant deaths, which we're already battling is extraordinarily high numbers in the Black communities. But these kinds of things will now be visited in white communities that have historically been exempt from disproportionate maternal and infant deaths. But now it's going to be very much generalized, and they're now going to start blaming doctors for this inevitable increase. And so this is what we foresee on the horizon. Those of us who use an intersectional analysis between the politics of white supremacy and the politics of gender. And this is what I'll be talking about. Most people, when they talk about white supremacy, they reduce it to racism. And they don't understand what a totalizing constellation of ideas white supremacy really represents. I see no space between white supremacy and neo-fascism as it operates in the 21st century, although there's a lot of debate right now on whether or not what we're seeing with the Make America, the MAGA people is actually neo-fascism. I'm not quite sure why we're debating semantics when it's so clear that they're acting like fascists. They have many of the characteristics of fascists. And, if it acts like a duck and quacks like a duck, I'm calling it a duck. But we have to correct the perception that white supremacy is only about racism. Of course, it includes racism, but it also includes settler colonialism, Christian nationalism, nativism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and the thing that brings us mostly into conversation around reproductive justice, biological determinism. And then this produces behavior that are homophobic, transphobic, ableist, classist, misogynist, and is practicing Islamophobia and authoritarianism. So if you don't have this fully developed, coherent analysis of white supremacy, you feel like you're playing whack-a-mole as you're taking on this issue and that issue and this issue, not seeing the connective worldview between all of these issues. And unfortunately, people who are progressive or leftists have a tendency to organize in silos, only addressing one portion of the white supremacist movement instead of seeing as a composite totalization. So the best way I can explain it is by showing you how the ideas of the far right or the rebranded alt-right migrate into our society. When we first started monitoring hate groups back in the 1979 was when the National Anti-Klan Network was formed, and it was formed after 5 anti-Klan protesters were killed in Greensboro, North Carolina. And Reverend C.T. Vivian, who'd been an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King, and Ann Braden, who was a white Kentuckian who had gone to jail for selling her house to a Black family, decided that we needed a permanent organization that would monitor hate groups because a lot of people were blindsided by the Klan openly murdering 5 people, having it caught on videotape, and them still getting acquitted for it. And so that's where we started coming together to set up the Center for the National Anti-Klan Network, as I said. But most people recognize the ideas of the far right because they use a worldview that says biology is destiny, that there is this racial hierarchy on which white people should be on the top and everybody else has different gradations with Black people being on the bottom. So it's actually very useful to teach about white supremacy through the black-white paradigm, because you're looking at the extreme, even though, of course, how anti-Asian racism manifests, how anti-Latino racism manifests, how anti-Indigenous, anti-Jewish, all of these things are quite different in their specifics. It is this totalizing worldview that pulls it all together. Richard Spencer tried to rebrand the far right, the alt-right, but there's no difference between them. It was just a cosmetic upgrade, I guess you can call it. But basically, they're the origin source of white supremacist ideas. And I also need to say at the outset that white supremacy is a body of ideas, and anybody can be a white supremacist. And quite logically, not all white people are white supremacists. Where whiteness is an identity, and that is a made-up social construct, the same way blackness is a made-up social construct. But so we should always articulate the difference between white supremacy, the ideology, and whiteness as an identity. Unfortunately, the people opposed to human rights consistently conflate those things because they have the expectation that everybody who is white should subscribe to the ideas of white supremacy. But unfortunately, that doesn't explain people like Clarence Thomas, who's obviously not white, but he subscribes to the ideas of white supremacy, and on and on. And as I said, of course, not all white people subscribe to these ideas. But on the far right, they believe that biology is destiny. And so when it comes to race and gender, for example, they believe that white women should be having babies for the purpose of addressing their fears of the great replacement theory, or white people are disappearing, because they're demographically doomed, basically, because by the middle of this century, some saying as early as 2045, white people will be a minority among other minorities. And so they're the ones who really push the idea that white people are superior, race is destiny, and that they are what we call biological determinists. Now, this next time we see these ideas, we see them in the hands of the religious right, and these ideas are getting acculturated through a moral lens. So instead of saying, we believe that Black people are inferior, they believe that Black people are just inherently sinful and need to be saved. And they believe that about everybody who doesn't share their particular religious views. So instead of using a racial justification for their white supremacist ideas, they use a religious justification for their white supremacist ideas. And of course, we see a whole range. White supremacists, by the way, don't all share the same religion. Some are atheists, some are Christian identity, Christian nationalists, but I'm talking about that portion of the religious right that's driving national politics right now in terms of forming that evangelical base for Donald Trump and things. So instead of saying race is the reason we support these ideas, they would argue that religion is. And this is what we also call Christian nationalists. The next time we see these ideas, they're in the hands of what I call economic conservatives. Others have called paleo conservatives. There's a bunch of names different researchers have named them. But basically, they say we don't use race as our rationale for our worldview. We don't use religion as our rationale. Instead, it's the economy. And you hear them mostly talking about how we're in this existential war of the makers of wealth at battle against the takers of wealth. That's the kind of thing that Mitt Romney let slip out of his lips when he was running for president, where Leonard Zeskin, my mentor, and one of my teachers, talks about the middle American radicals, where they're mad at the top and they're mad at the bottom. But the economic conservatives are mostly represented by things like the Heritage Foundation. The right-wing libertarian wing of that movement is by the Cato Institute, for example, that can be surprisingly populist sounding with their opposition to the prison industrial complex. But on every other issue, they are the segregationists who felt that the federal government went too far in desegregating America. Now, that doesn't mean that all libertarians think that, because there's a right, a center, and a left-wing set of the libertarians, but I'm talking about the right. So as I said, the economic conservatives don't use race, they don't use religion, they use economics to justify the same white supremacist ideas. So that by the time the average person encountered these ideas, they're being put into practice in our traditional institutions. And so we see these white supremacist ideas showing up in the police departments, where they think they can murder Black people with impunity and no accountability, in our welfare departments, with the assumption that anybody showing up to get welfare is just trying to unfairly game the system and hurt all the hardworking people who support the system. That's that takers versus makers narrative. Or the belief that people of color are having too many babies, particularly Black and Mexican ones are having too many babies, and that's why we have to restrict their population growth, but at the same time encourage white population growth, and on. And so until you understand the symbiosis and the movement of these ideas, you don't really understand how the ideas that David Duke promulgated in the late 1980s became mainstream public policy in the hands of Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, etc. In terms of its effect on abortion politics, Carol Mason has done a wonderful job. I think she's at the University of Kentucky, talking about how the rationale for opposition to abortion has switched from unborn, protecting innocent lives or protecting women, now has become a question of the moral order of that it's a moral obligation to make sure that white babies are born so that white people don't become a minority. And in her analysis, Minority Unborn, you see this. And so it's, instead of racial superiority that the far right nakedly uses, they talking about a moral superiority that again is borrowing from the Christian nationalists, claiming that they're genetically, biologically, culturally, and morally superior. And so when you look at some of the earliest writings on gender and the white supremacist imagination, Abby, I teach your book, White Man Falling, so it's great, what an honor it is to be here sharing this stage with you. But also David Newer talks about the eliminationist, because we're dealing with this intersection of gender and race or white supremacy, where they're basically saying that the only acceptable form of white male identity is extremely patriarchal, is based on this extreme binary of race and gender, as I say, what we call biological determinism. They are so obsessed with interracial sex and sexuality, and yet they are also eroticizing a lot of violence. They are romanticizing violence, and this is really deeply rooted in sexual fear. And of course, they've been talking for decades that they're losing social power because of the civil rights movement, because of the immigrant rights movement, because of the LGBT movement, on and on. And we saw this represented in a film starring Michael Douglas called Falling Down, which is an excellent Hollywood portrayal of that fear of white men falling. And they're feeling very overwhelmed, disenfranchised, and angry at a system that they feel is leaving them behind. So of course they're committed to making America great again, when they felt like they were dominant, they were in charge, and they did not have to be accountable to anyone who did not share their race and gender. And of course, you have people like Tucker Carlson and others, preaching this white extinction theory, Steve Bannon, on, which says that it requires an organized, violent response. And David Newer calls this is the eliminationist movement. Let's eliminate all of our competitors for sharing this country and sharing political power. And that's why we have to deconstruct democracy, because one person, one vote will not permanently protect white privilege. By the way, that is not an original observation or a recent one. John C. Calhoun said the same thing in 1837 as a senator from South Carolina, you know, before the Civil War, that he could predict that a one man, one vote system would not permanently protect white supremacy. I'm sorry, somebody behind me is doing something. So you have to work on the intersection of race and gender to understand the present reproductive politics are going around. Even Brenton Tarrant, he's the terrorist who slaughtered 51 Muslims at the Al Noor Mosque and a cultural center in Christchurch, New Zealand. He said he did it because of the falling white birth rate. And so fascism is forced regression into embracing a particularly type of toxic patriarchy, because women's fertility is always the focus. Every empire needs bodies. And if you go back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece societies, you can find that Emperor Augustus ordered upper class Roman women to have more children. Now, one could ask the question, well, why would he have to do that? Unfortunately, the men who kept records did not see preserving the perspectives of women as a priority. So we don't have any records of what elite Roman women thought about Augustus ordering them to have more children. But we can speculate that he was ordering them to have more children because they were having too few in his eyes. And we do have other data that shows that ancient Egyptians, and particularly people in North Africa, had knowledge about birth control and abortifacients that they were using to regulate their fertility. And of course, as they interacted with Romans, this knowledge traveled across the sea. And then Roman women started using these same techniques, which led to the Roman panic around falling birth rates. They weren't having fewer sex, they were less sex, they were having fewer children. And of course, the same tendency happened with the Comstock Law in 1873, where Postmaster General Comstock wanted white women to have more babies to fulfill the manifest destiny, again, pretending, as most settler colonial states do, that there was an empty land basically waiting for the right people to benefit it and colonize it and things like that. And so, of course, the Comstock Law prohibited distribution of birth control information and devices by calling it obscene, lewd, or lascivious material. One of the mistakes that I feel that the pro-choice movement makes, that's dominated by white women, is that they don't take a racialized analysis to the forced breeding of white women. When you hear forced breeding, is something that's always assumed to only concern enslaved Black women, enslaved kidnapped African women. But forced breeding is part of the mandate of what's in a settler colonial narrative. And even the American Medical Association led a campaign to ban abortion because they didn't like the competition from the midwives, particularly in the Black community, who were providing the majority of the birthing and abortion and even burial services at the time. And of course, Francis Galton, the cousin to Charles Darwin, invented the concept of eugenics in England, and the upper classes loved the concept of eugenics because it was a theory of genetic inferiority, again, positing that the white race was the superior genetic stock and everybody else was inferior to them. And the one reason is that the upper class people like Galton's theory so much is that there was a lot of misery in the industrialization of England taking place at the time, and they were able to use Galton's theory the same way that people use the bell curve today to say that We don't have to provide any services for these people because they're genetically predisposed to be unable to benefit from our care and compassion. So it is illogical for us to prioritize taking care of their needs because they would not benefit from it. And we see this formulation over and over again. And so basically, the analysis is saying that our current restrictions on abortion, birth control, and sex ed are all part of a scheme to control the fertility of all women, to increase for heterosexual women and decrease for everyone else. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is new euphemisms come out that wrap themselves around feminist language. So they're saying now that they're not they're not for population control, they're for population stabilization, or the population time bomb theory that Ehrlich talked about, that I'll be going into in more detail. And perhaps the most offensive new euphemism that they're talking about is called population justice. Watch out for that one, where they're taking the concept of social justice and reproductive justice and perverting it to mean its opposite. But this is what people do. They commit these language coups where they seize a word and make its meaning the opposite of what it actually means, like the way they've done with woke and a whole lot of other stuff. So if I'm lucky, I'm going to show you a video that says all of this without explicitly mentioning
the Romans in the time of Julius Caesar were totally preoccupied by the fear that they were not producing enough children. The sterile pagan nobility died out, and with them their ancestors' idea of Rome.
No one wanted to have any children, and no one wanted to get married.
Catastrophically falling birth rates, well below the replacement level.
It's entirely possible that the French will disappear. There will be no native-born French that come from the traditional French population.
What some call the demographic winter of Western societies.
It's happening in rich countries, it's happening in poor countries, it's happening in Catholic countries, Islamic countries, and that is everywhere. People are having fewer and fewer children. Never in history have we had economic prosperity accompanied by depopulation.
When there are many too many old people and not very many young people to work and to look after them, which is what's on the books now, mathematically speaking, you're going to have economic collapse. There won't be enough people to run the trains or pay the taxes.
For those of us who were raised to believe in the teachings of Thomas Malthus or Charles Darwin, for example, these trends are very hard to absorb.
And for such a small nation as Latvia, it might even endanger the survival of our nation.
The only way you can sort of preserve the theory is to say, well, certain kinds of human beings are on the way to extinction.
Now we have 40 years of social science that makes it absolutely clear that the deterioration of marriage, the encouragement of sexuality outside of marriage is just not, it's not good for society, women, children, or men.
On every measure ever measured by the social sciences, the intact married family is the strongest on every outcome ever measured.
We, as the policymakers, think that the best way to improve the demographic situation is by strengthening the families.
It's also true, I think, for people who are worried about women's rights, about the gay rights, about environmentalism, All of these movements are deeply informed by a 1970s era preoccupation with the so-called population bomb. There's not much quibble. There's not much controversy among people in the know.
So let me get out of here. So why don't I do this? I want to stop the share for a minute and get your reflections on what you just saw in that film. Did you notice that it was very fearful, but one thing they did not say was the word race? What did y'all think about that? This is a film that was distributed, almost is always distributed to every member of Congress every year. Has anybody seen it and be previously, other than those of us that study this stuff? Please don't give them any more money. You saw all of the portions of it that are necessary. Keisha.
Yeah, it was very disturbing and upsetting. And a potential other way to tell the story is why it's important for us to have borders that promote immigration, and why it's important for us to kind of restructure our economy so that people have more opportunities to form and be self-sufficient in households and those kinds of things. Like, so what they're constructing as a problem is a particular view of society and the demise of the upper middle class white family and all of the people who are involved in supporting that. And yeah, that being unspoken, as if we all should be sad that that thing is dying. I think, okay, that makes room for us to think about how we could live together in very different kinds of ways than we have thus far.
Who did they demonize in the film? Who did they blame?
Someone in the chat, but it's all women's fault.
Oh, but not only just women, queer folks too.
Yeah.
And all of these immigrants, so that France won't be France anymore.
Yeah. And to your point of intersectionality, it's white women's fault, because the women of color who do have babies, the rhetoric is that we're having too many and we need to stop that and get married. So it is a particular kind of family and particular racialized version of that.
Right. I think Nico is saying, I haven't seen it, but it reinforces the narrative that white supremacists, I lost them. Could someone read out the rest of that to me? It faded from view before I could catch the whole source of it, what Nico was saying.
It says, I haven't seen it, but reinforces the narrative that white supremacy, heteropatriarchy is a necessary condition for a thriving world. They blame academics, immigrants, people of color, and women and queer folk.
Absolutely. It's all our fault, right? We're just making these white women too smart to just lay down and have 18 kids and counting. I mean, that's part of the narrative. So let me go back to the share. Again, I told you I do lousy PowerPoints. I hope y'all are keeping up, because mine are terrible. So what we're seeing is the symbiosis between misogyny and white supremacy, and I think this is understudied. And what's so ironic is that they actually act like they hate women, but it's necessary to manage our reproduction. And it's kind of like they hate the fact that they need women even. And of course, I'm going to give a lot of time this evening to talk about how they recruit conservative women to be anti-feminists who believe they'll be protected if they are sufficiently subservient to the patriarchy. And of course, this manifested itself in their hatred against Hillary Clinton. It's happening now to Kamala Harris. I mean, on and on and on. And of course, Trump just emboldens all of this because of his lack of accountability for misogynist violence. And what is really even more distressing is the way that the number of men of color who are increasingly voting for white supremacists like Trump, because they are the failed patriarchs who want to have the same power and privileges that they see white men having. And Roger Devlin, who's a white nationalist, a white supremacist, he's constantly, and he's really responsible for a lot of what we consider the incel culture, because he wrote some of the earliest theories on it. And, you know, men's rights, he's helped, you know, start the whole men's rights movement, saying women's choices must be strictly limited because women are less likely to get married, have children, and obey men to perpetuate the white race and stuff. And so they recruit these intensely alienated white young men into the white supremacist movement, but not just white men, because of course we saw with the Proud Boys that they're also recruiting men of color who have this massive anger at women for not eagerly providing sex and being obedient, and claim that women are too emotional to make decisions and are incapable of handling our capricious behavior, when it seems like all the wars I've ever seen in the world are started by men who can't handle their emotions. Interesting, when you look at the far right and the white supremacist movement, they have different opinions on abortion depending on who's having the abortion, because they actually eagerly accept that Black and brown and women of color will have abortions. It's for white women, they wanted them restricted. And if you read Martha Ward's book, Poor Women, Powerful Men, you talk about how she analyzes the history of how white Republicans supported birth control and abortion as long as it was seen as a strategy to contain Black and brown communities and indigenous communities. But when the women's movement was seen as benefiting from birth control and abortion, that's when they flipped, because they wanted to discourage white women from using birth control and abortion. And people like Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Richard Nixon went from being pro-choice into anti-abortion. But this is not original. Hitler monitored the periods of German women. And, you know, we still now have these men now saying they should track women's periods through these pregnancy apps, through these period apps that are going on, that they want state health departments to turn in records of women's periods or women who are seeking abortions, et cetera, et cetera. And this is straight out of the Nazi playbook, because the Nazis paid women to have children by providing homes and loans and grants and funding childcare. And that raises a real question that if the far right and their enablers in the Republican Party, et cetera, because I frankly don't see any reason to distinguish between the far right, the religious right, the paleo conservatives and the traditional bigots, they see a distinction, but I don't see a real distinction between them. But if they were as smart as they pretended to be, instead of using coercion, they could incentivize their plan. What if they told white women, we will forgive your student loan debt if you have a baby, or we'll forgive $10,000 for every baby that you have, or we will provide a low interest loan for you to buy your first home to raise that child in, or we will provide free access to child care or health care, and persuaded women that way. I'm convinced that a large number of white women would change their minds and choose to have babies if it was incentivized. But I actually don't worry about that too much because that would require them to embrace something that is anathema to them, and that's a feminist agenda. These people would never come within an inch of embracing a feminist agenda around free childcare, health care, those kinds of human rights issues that we're always fighting for. They don't want to become within an inch of that. So they're going to do it through compulsion, when in fact, they would be more logically successful if they did it through incentives like the Nazis did. But they are saying that when women were given a right to vote, that created a problem. When they were given education, that created a problem. And so you actually see wings of the far right movement saying that women should not be allowed to vote. They want to repeal the 19th Amendment, and and you're seeing these increasing narratives being pushed by not only the far right, but the mainstream Republicans about education being a waste of women's time, being in the workforce for elite white women is a waste and stuff. And so they're really promoting femininity over feminism as a war against women's independence and self-determination. And we're seeing a lot of pro-white activism like we saw in the 1950s and 60s that I'll be talking about, the white women who were resisting integration, and a commitment to bullying all women who don't agree with their goals or stay in their assigned places. So again, bad PowerPoint, so let me just put it all up here. What we're also seeing is an overlap between the gender critical anti-trans movement and the men's rights movement in terms of political radicalization online, hyper-focus on trans issues and fear of being replaced in variations of these great replacement fear mongering. And then really saying we're too busy erasing distinctions on the basis of sex. But particularly the incels and the MRAs and white supremacists all share a sense of entitlement. And they believe that they're owed jobs, economic superiority, sex, simply because of their identities. And yet they're the ones who accuse people of color and women of practicing identity politics, which is kind of ironic. And they are frequently mass murderers of women, cis and trans, by these failed patriarchs who feel like they're lacking and they have something to prove. For cis women, mass killings are very frequent, while trans women are usually targeted more individually. They also have a very strong strain of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia within their ranks, as both being seen as attacks on Western civilization. If you read some of their writings, they see themselves as the real lost tribes kind of rhetoric you hear. And they accuse Jews in particular of leading the destruction of the white race by fomenting unrest among African American and immigrants. And so you end up with the Pittsburgh synagogue slaying in 2018 or the El Paso Walmart shootings in 2019. And it is important to note that having differences in gender and racial identities can influence, but they don't mitigate or completely disguise the white supremacist thinking. So just because one has other intersectional identities doesn't mean that we have not all been socialized into some form of beliefs in white supremacy. But white men are always portrayed as victims of feminism, queer rights, political correctness, and the Democrats, who are, of course, being demonized, and feminists accused of destroying the family and the values of Western civilization. This is not original. They've been saying that from the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848 to the campaign for women to get the right to vote. So the thing that makes monitoring white supremacists relatively easy is how unoriginal they are, because everything they say and do has been done in the past to maintain and defend white supremacy. And so there's a portion, though, of the gender critical movement that longs for a past in which women's biology, gynocentric feminism, was the major definer of their role in society. So it's interesting how people that moved so far to the left, they ended up on the right. And until the 21st century, most anti-fascist organizations didn't see this intersection between race and gender that I was privileged to see. It was in 1994 that I issued, no, 1992, I think it was, that I issued the first Women's Watch report that showed that the same people who were showing up at Klan rallies and committing hate crimes were the same people we were monitoring who was showing up and committing violence against abortion providers in the clinics. And 6 months after I issued the Women's Watch report was when the first abortion doctor was killed down in Florida in 1993. And because people are organized into silos, it makes discussing the differences and commonalities that we all share as a human rights movement very difficult, even as the culture war gets magnified and weaponized against us. The other thing, though, that a radical feminist like me points out is that it's a grave mistake to only see white supremacist violence as a criminal problem. That's part of what that's part of what I disagree with the earlier analysis, for example, of the Southern Poverty Law Center, that they're convinced that the best way to fight white supremacy is to beef up law enforcement. Those of us who have a more radical analysis says we are not going to enlarge the prison industrial complex or the militarization of our communities as an answer to white supremacy. It's a social, it's a social problem, it's an economic problem, it's a problem of how people are making decisions and deciding whose lives matter and why. Bell, of course, was a friend, and she wrote very cogently that patriarchy knows no gender, because it's not just angry white men. Let's talk a little bit more about white women in the movement. Too often, women have been written out of the history of hate and the related phenomena because of sexism and the assumption that women are as powerful or capable as men, or if they join the movement, it's because they're the wives of or the girlfriends of. And that's simply not true, because it's a dangerous mistake to write the agency of white women out in support of white supremacy. We call this the patriarchal bargain, where white women decide to accept gender roles that disadvantage women in exchange for whatever power they can wrest from the system and their power to dominate others. We call this the Karen effect nowadays. And women who react frequently with misogynistic men are frequently praised and rewarded by those men for their complicity in their roles that they play. And they are very active in the commission of white supremacist social and physical and epistemological violence, like Moms for Liberty right now. White nationalists have long used their defense of women's rights and innocence as a justification, like Birth of a Nation, the way it was tracked to what happened to Emmett Till, or all the waves of lynchings and hate crimes and Tulsa massacre, what happened in Rosewood, I mean, on and on. And so they also play a heavy role in influencing what textbooks teach. And so, for example, in Texas, my home state, they're calling kidnapped, enslaved African voluntary immigrants looking for work. How can we fight white supremacy when they insist on continually brainwashing their own children? And of course, women did start Klan auxiliaries in the 1920s, with their greatest strength being in the South and the Midwest. Kathleen Blee in her books have written about this, but even being openly fascist by founding the Women's Auxiliary of the pro-Nazi German-American Bund. Some of you may have seen that picture of Madison Square Garden, where 20,000 American Nazis gathered together in 1939 to support Hitler. Elizabeth McRae has written, I skipped one. Of course, all these Confederate statues that we're campaigning to get pulled down now weren't built during the Civil War or right after the Civil War. They were built, they didn't start building these till 40 years after the Civil War because they wanted to reinforce Jim Crow segregation and the weaponizing of white femininity to increase lynchings and racial murders. And now, of course, Donald Trump is talking about protecting white women from immigrants, Muslims, and thugs from the inner cities. Elizabeth McCrae has written a book called Mothers of Masters Resistance that specifically focuses on the role white women played in resisting the Brown v. Board of Education 1954 decision ordering the desegregation of schools, and talked about how it wasn't just about schools, about how they shut down swimming pools, started even private pools in people's yards because they shut down public swimming pools because they didn't want to share them, transportation, neighborhoods, and other public services. And of course, this incessant child-based removal system from indigenous people and from overseas families. But most of the pressure, and this is something that I don't think is studied enough, is the naked commodification of white babies. If you go to the adoption conferences where people are speaking to the pain of being adopted or the pain of giving up children for adoption, you see this entire 100-year history of the commodification of white babies and the extreme agony is causing in the white community, yet nobody's seeing it generally as a feminist issue or a human rights issue. And of course, Concerned Women of America, Phyllis Schlafly, others, they led the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment, which is why women still aren't in the US Constitution. Or they have the Network of Enlightened Women fighting against liberalism on college campuses. And of course, they're joined by Turning Point and Campus Reform. That if you study the right-wing organizations, these are student-targeted organizations that target students to get them to not only promote right-wing thinking on campus, but they actually again are leading the question of whether or not women should be on those campuses. And of course, the Conservative Women's Organization is recruiting women to run for public office. And what's paradoxical is how many LGBTQ people have bought into white supremacy, so much so that there's a trans person who calls herself Miss Trump USA. And if you pay attention to Trump rallies, she generally shows up at all of these things. Sisterhood in Sheets is the analysis saying, we can't give a comprehensive analysis of white supremacy without looking at the role of women. As I talked about Kathleen Blee's book, Women in the Klan, Racism and Gender in the 1920s, Mothers of Massive Resistance by Elizabeth McCrae. And, but female segregationists were from across the political spectrum in the nation, not just in the South. And they had various degrees of education and statuses. Some were college educated, but not all. They were diverse ages, some married, some single, and they lived in both urban, suburban, and rural areas, but they were united in support of white supremacist racial hierarchy and the belief in patriarchal men who they counted on to protect them. And so, of course, we're still dealing with the far-right groups seeking to regulate women's bodies, not only by opposing birth control and abortion, but claiming they are vulnerable to attacks by immigrants, Muslims, trans women, etc. And again, just recruit alienated men. These are the groups that recruit vulnerable, alienated white women. And they really search for pride in their white identity and claim that the left only teaches shame in whiteness. So if you want to feel proud about who you are and proud about your whiteness, come join us. Because if you work with those other people, they're just going to make you feel shameful about feeling white. And of course, that's the rhetoric we hear when they talk and attack, critical race theory. So when you talk about the impact of gendering white supremacy, it's about their attacks on public education, censoring textbooks, how they need to maintain Jim Crow forms, minimizing slavery, building organizations to oppose integration. Of course, and also not teaching about queer politics, theory, feminism, any of those things. And this has gone on for so long that it's affected how most Americans have such a flawed view of U.S. history and race relations. And so now we're seeing these modern attacks on free race, critical race, on free speech, critical race theory, and evidence-based science, which has gone on since the Scopes monkey trial of the 1920s. Most Southern women are decidedly anti-feminist and believe they lose their special status if they don't support the patriarchy. But I do have a story to tell about the Pink Pussy March and Southern white women. I think y'all remember the 2017 Pink Pussy March that opposed Donald Trump's election, 600 demonstrations across the globe. And a friend of mine, one of the women who co-founded Sister Song, was named Juanita Williams. And she lived in rural South Carolina, Orangeburg, South Carolina. And she was part of a knitting crafting circle. And she wanted her Christian group to knit the pink pussy hats for the march. And when she told it to this group of grandmothers, because Juanita was a grandmother, all her knitting friends were grandmothers, they recoiled in horror because these white Trump supporting women, they weren't resisting because of politics. They were resisting because they could not use the word pussy to relate to their body parts. And so Juanita, being the smart, loving person that she was, started leading them in singing, "What's new, pussycat? Whoa, whoa, whoa. What's new, pussycat?" I can't sing, but I hope y'all recognize the Tom Jones song. And she reported that by leading them in 2 weeks of singing "What's New, Pussycat" together, they knitted 200 caps for the Pink Pussy March. So we really have to figure out ways to reach these people culturally in some kind of way, because you can't really address them directly through their politics, because they didn't get to hold the positions that they hold through logic. So logic is not going to dissuade them. We have to sophisticate our strategies, but that's another speech. But I just wanted to give you that example. And of course, there is this biological determinist view that there are good genes out here versus bad genes. Trump is always talking about his good genes. And that's, of course, is indistinguishable from the Nazi rhetoric that led to Jews, disabled people, LGBTQ people, Romani, and others being exterminated. And as I said earlier, the Republican Party in the 70s and early 80s dropped total support for abortion rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, and gender equality because they wanted to mobilize Southern women against the feminist movement. And this current MAGA theme of white excellence and innocence that they're pushing right now is an intentional attempt to remove from people's consciousness the violence history of colonization, slavery, and structural racism. And then they don't even want to talk about how most colleges and universities supported segregation and white supremacist policies. When we start talking about why this building is named for Woodrow Wilson and how he pushed all Black people out of the civil service after he showed Birth of a Nation at the White House. I mean, they don't want us to tell that history. I maintain that they don't want us to teach the real history because they have every intention of repeating that history. And I don't think the media does a good job in reporting this and this whole myth of colorblindness. And they are really good at not only co-opting words, but co-opting feminist ideas like pretending to care for the women, pretending to care for the environment, to pretending to care for women. The white supremacist movement, since they are demographically doomed, they have a couple of strategies, only a few strategies available to them. One of which is that they can destroy democracy, which they're trying to do, so that they create kind of like an apartheid-like situation that only certain people are allowed to franchise, allowed to have political power, and in many ways allowed to have economic power. So that's one strategy. Or they can do all this restriction of birth control and abortion so that they can increase the numbers of white people in the country. But another way to increase the numbers of white people in the country is to broaden the definition of who is defined as white. And so this is something that they have periodically done over time. And we need more analysis about how increasingly immigrants who can pass are now being recruited into embracing the ideas of white supremacy. I think high-income Asians are particularly vulnerable to this. High-income Latinos are vulnerable to this. And I'm not so sure there'll ever be any acceptance of high-income Black people, because even Oprah gets racially profiled when she goes shopping. But the point is that it's a question of even this provisional acceptance is going to act just like the provisional acceptance of the Jews who are white, because of course not all Jewish people are white, but the ones who are white, they were provisionally accepted as belonging to the white franchise until they weren't. That's why in Charlottesville in 2017, they were marching around saying, Jews shall not replace us, etc. It's got the anti-Semitism and the Islamophobia is always right below the surface. So whether or not, white North Africans be called white, even if it is offered, it will be only temporary. And so, and let's be clear, the sterilization of Carrie Buck was because she was off-white. She was white, but she was poor. And that's why she got sterilized by the Supreme Court Buck versus Bell decision in 1927. And so most people, when we teach about white supremacy, we don't talk about how it was also about the disenfranchisement of poor white people in the South. And nationally, so division among poor white people so they wouldn't challenge white elites. And as I said, they are developing intentional capacity for absorbing new subjects, including people who were thought of non-white, because they didn't used to think that people from the Iberian Peninsula were white because of the colonization of the Iberian Peninsula by the Moors of North Africa. So they always suspected that they had African blood in them. And so, again, it wasn't until the 20th century that they started thinking of Italians and Spanish and Portuguese as white. And so we've seen this expansion of the definition of whiteness periodically when the real white people, which they consider themselves Northern Europeans as the real white people, end up in a racial panic. And so having a white identity always provides a racial advantage, but other vulnerabilities because of gender, class, ability do compromise that advantage and sometimes change it. And of course, you could talk about land distribution policies like the Homestead Act, about benefiting white people, but only white people of a certain kind. Because of course, with the Japanese internment, they took land away from Japanese people during World War II. And so you always have to figure out how white supremacy is operating in these things. And of course, when we're dealing with expansion and empire migrations as features of white supremacy, it has this transnational and domestic impact around militarism, immigration, and of course the genocide against Native American women. I want to stop and do a time check because I've been talking a lot and seeing if I'm belaboring stuff, offering new information, boring you to death. Abby, why don't you give me a temperature check on how I'm doing?
Well, it's 20 after 5 Mountain Time, so we have another 40 minutes left. I think you're doing terrific. I haven't seen questions in the chat, but a few comments. Are there any questions right now? Anyone would like to raise their hand and pose before we move forward? This might be a good time for some dialogue.
I noticed, Keisha, you put your hand up, and so I was just wondering if there was something that you wanted to add.
No, I put up a heart just to say that I love this, and I've been working on a piece on white Christian nationalism and kind of how it is undermining democracy, and talking about the Moms for Liberty and the comparison with Daughters of the Confederacy and the massive resistance. So I love how you are introducing for me like so many new resources and frames. I will be writing to get a copy of your very dense slides, because there is a lot of information here that I think will be very helpful for me in my work. So thank you. Please continue.
Okay, what I find is that people don't use a sufficiently intersectional analysis. You know, intersection is not just a word, it's a way of understanding history in a different way and stuff. And they think of intersectionality as just a statement of identities. No, intersectionality is a statement of vulnerabilities. What about your identity makes you vulnerable to a particular type of oppression that someone without that identity is not vulnerable to? So it's not just a statement of identities. I hate it. I don't like how people just reduce it to, well, I'm a Scottish bagpiper. That's my intersectional identity. And I said, only if people are oppressing bagpipers. I mean, really? You know? So let's keep on. Let me share the screen again. Slideshow. And hide the meeting controls again. I'm gonna try to wrap it up in 10 minutes so that we have more time for discussion. Or if you like, I'll just keep on because I'm about 2/3 of the way through. I talked about biological determinism. We can't talk about this without talking about eugenics, because eugenics is the white supremacist rationale for trying to engineer and manage populations. And so, and we see all these different rationales for eugenics, from when Thomas Malthus started talking about the world being unable to feed each other, to Paul Ehrlich writing the population time bomb, to people on the left talking about the world is overpopulated, we need to control the reproduction of people in the global south, and et cetera, et cetera. And so we continue to have to fight these concepts of eugenics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is available and we've got a short period of time, but this is Thomas Malthus, who talked about population, and then you had Francis Galton talking about eugenics, as I talked about earlier, a positive eugenics to create, to have the right populations increase, and negative eugenics to decrease the wrong population. And then, you know, we end up with the Supreme Court decision that legalized the sterilization of Carrie Buck. And then even people as recently, you know, 1990s, where they talk about eugenics and people collect welfare because they can't afford to take care of all these children. But 9 generations is enough. These women have to learn to control themselves to make the same effort as everyone else, read white. And if they can't do it or won't do it, then something has to be done. And then we had the former Congressman Steve King. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies. Again, demographic winter. And it also ends up on the left, because this isn't just the right. Zero population growth, carrying capacity of Earth. These are words around people having problems with some parts of the population that they think is overproducing babies, while they're not addressing the maldistribution of resources. That's really the chief source of environmental degradation and the militarization of the planet. Ricky Solinger has written a wonderful anthology with Mia Nakachi on reproductive states, and it's really analyzes how governments worldwide try to dictate family planning policies, as China's previous one-child policy, and on and on. That's where I found the information about Hitler monitoring women's periods and stuff. And so if you want to look at population control on a global scale, I recommend reading Reproductive States. There's always justifications for population control with eugenical mindsets. In the 1950s, it was to combat communism. In the 1960s, to quell urban unrest and riots. In the 1970s, under Nixon, it was to restore law and order. In the 80s, we began talking about environmental degradation and resource scarcity. So by the 1990s, it was seen as, oh, the global South is having a youth bulge, too many young people being born, and they're too restive, and there isn't enough jobs for them, particularly with the structural adjustment policies that the IMF and the World Bank was imposing on these countries. By the 2000s, we were talking about too many people being born because it was challenging our ability to combat global terrorism. And now we're talking about we can't advance the global security state with all these people. So this is why we created the Reproductive Justice Framework, and I'll close in this because we've already said what it is. You know, that there was too much focus on the abortion, and as if the scope of reproductive oppression was just restricting abortion. We who were having our human rights violated had to develop new ways of thinking, strategizing, and organizing, and create new alliances. And that's why we came up with reproductive justice, and we chose to use the global human rights framework to claim not only the right to health care, but also all the other issues that affect our reproductive decisions as obligations of the government to provide these things. And by defining our core problem as reproductive repression as population control, we actually needed to develop a critique of neoliberal capitalism and how to move forward against white supremacy. The three original principles, to have a child, not to have a child, to parent our children. And then we added a fourth principle 10 years later, because the original one was created in 1994, and in 2004, we expanded it. Individuals have the human right to disassociate sex from reproduction, and healthy sexuality and pleasure are essential components to a whole and full human life. That was in response to needing to be trans and queer inclusive in a reproductive justice analysis, because not everybody wants to have babies. And we had to set up standards for what is considered reproductive justice, because everybody was glomming all over the term, but they didn't mean it. They weren't using intersectionality. They weren't basing it on the human rights framework as its moral, legal, and political foundation. They weren't centering vulnerable people. They weren't linking local conditions to global conditions. They weren't also understanding that the ability of an individual to make an autonomous reproductive decision is linked to the structures of inequality in which they're embedded. And we have to address cultural assumptions, build power, and that because it's a human rights framework, although it was created by Black women, it doesn't only apply to Black women because it includes everyone. And then reproductive justice model talks about reproductive health, the service delivery component of our movement, where we treat individual patients and we treat diseases and disorders and try to have optimal health. But that's a very individualistic approach, because we don't necessarily, as we're treating somebody who has all these comorbidities or whatever, we're not asking about the weathering conditions that cause these comorbidities to happen. Anyway, reproductive rights is synonymous with pro-choice. It's the legal advocacy within the confines of the U.S. Constitution to fight to keep abortion, birth control, and effective evidence-based sex education affordable, available, and legal. And reproductive justice we see as the human rights organizing framework. Our job is to bring the people together who work on a lot of other social justice issues like housing rights or racism or the environment and on and on and on, into understanding that all of these are reproductive justice issues as well. So now that I'm at time, I'm going to stop the share. I do have more PowerPoints to show, but I want to see if y'all would rather have discussion now. Are there any questions accumulated in the chat?
I don't see any. Does anyone have any questions? You could raise your hand. I'm sure there's some out there.
I'm gonna say y'all gotta disagree with something I said. I hope you do.
Well, can I ask you a question, Loretta?
Absolutely.
So, knowing this work you've been doing for 50 years, or, seems like that
50,
long.
yeah, more than 50.
Yeah, me too. So, and working in this sort of the same field with you, I'm just wondering, personally, at any point, have you been surprised that we got to this place we are at now in terms of the attacks on reproductive justice, in terms of the degree to which you pointed out we can't really distinguish between the far right white supremacists and mainstream republicanism anymore? Or 20 years ago, 25 years ago, did you imagine we might be where we are today?
As a Black person, I can honestly say that we've never had the luxury of depending on the Supreme Court or any other democratic institution to be the source of our liberation. So we kind of have to have that kind of jaundiced view towards the limits of what the current system can provide and is willing to provide. And then everything it provides, like Carol Anderson writes, is going to backlash to anyway.
Right.
So we have a different relationship to our expectations of what the democracy we've never enjoyed can deliver.
Mhm.
Barbara Jordan used to say, I just want America as good as his promises. And we've never had that.
No,
And so, no, I'm not discouraged and I'm not surprised. I think that it's a privilege to have the opportunity to say the things now that would have gotten my parents lynched. Because my father was born in 1918, my mom in 1922. And so the fact that I'm privileged enough to sit on my ass and say all these frankly frightening things to white people who need to hear it, even though I try to say it with love and respect, is a privilege that I never take for granted. Because I know the blood that was shed to get me here, and I'm never going to be disrespectful of that blood by claiming, oh, I'm too tired, I'm too wore out. I'm like, really? You sitting on your ass. While my mother raised 8 kids, while cleaning white folks' hands on her head, on her knees. And she did what she could do in the struggle. My dad was in the army when it was still segregated. Went through 3 wars to provide for his 8 kids. So I have a very boomer view towards people who say that they're too tired to struggle. I'm like, really? The fact that we're even having this conversation means that you're the beneficiary of somebody else's struggle. Can you appreciate that? The way we say it in the civil rights movement is that people get in trouble when they imagine that they're the entire chain of freedom. The chain of freedom stretches back from our ancestors and stretches forward to our descendants. The only thing we have to worry about is not letting the chain of freedom break at our link. So don't give up in despair or apathy or get mad because you don't control how fast the freedom train moves or how much you get accomplished. Now, I mean, we're looking at, we have all these reasons to feel despair, but we do not have the right to actually indulge in it. We can't give up, to honor our ancestors and be good ancestors for our descendants. And I find that when I think about just not letting the link break at my link, the chain break at my link, I feel relieved because I don't feel it's all on my shoulders. I don't have to get everything right. I don't have to do it perfectly. I just have to not give up. And that feels really good to me. I'm sorry, Keisha, you've had your hand up for a while. And
Oh, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but
you're not, I'm dominating the conversation. You're asking questions and
we're here
making
to hear you.
comments.
But I do have a couple of specific questions. So one, as I said before, I love the analysis of gendered white supremacy and explaining how all of this is built on this kind of false notion of human hierarchy. And that is about racism and gender and ableism and sexuality, and all of those things exist together. And my question, I have two related questions to that, is when we're trying to unpack that, expose that, show these interconnections, does it matter which title we use? Because you kind of started in that chart with far right, alt right, and moved over to the Christian right, and then moved down or whatever. And so in this discussion, we've been talking about white supremacy for a number of reasons. I was thinking about talking about this as white Christian nationalism. And so I'm curious if there's anything that's gained or lost in the terminology when we switch around those different parts of the circle. If you could talk about how you think that influence is mobilizing. And then my second related question is,
can you hold it? Because I'll forget the first one if you ask
oh,
two at the
okay,
same
go ahead,
time.
go ahead, respond.
I had a really good time in the 60s, so I can't remember shit. Let's focus on the first one. First, as academics, we want specificity because we have to teach it. Now, when I'm doing my popular education, I may be a little more sloppy around the terms that I use because I want to speak in the register that I think my audience is going to hear. But there are differences between the far right, the Christian nationalists, and like I said, there's even different degrees within those who are all using the word Christian. So specificity is our forte. That's what we do. So I encourage people to be as precise as they can be to still be audible to the audience. So for the same way I don't use people of color when I mean Black people. I want to be as precise as I can and still being legible to the audience that I'm speaking to. So they're not interchangeable. We should know the differences between them, but in terms of public policy and practices, their differences really are indistinguishable right now. So what was your second question?
And the second was related around mobilizing. So what are you talked about us needing new ways of thinking and new ways of organizing to kind of pull people in who have been, on the sidelines. And I'm thinking in particular around, how do we get more people who aren't the ones who are already on the bottom of those various hierarchies engaged in dismantling that hierarchy? So what's
I'm having a whole lot of fun doing just that. In my white supremacy class, I devote the last quarter of the semester to a concept called appropriate whiteness. And that is how do you repurpose the white identity in the fight against white supremacy? And I start off by telling a little story that hopefully y'all can resonate with. Y'all remember those two Black men that were racially profiled at the Starbucks when they were waiting for their work colleague, how quickly that story went out and got viral? Everybody nods. Y'all remember the story? Do you remember why you know the story? You know the story because a white woman pulled out her cell phone and filmed it because she said, I know I'm not going to get harassed by the police and I'm not going to let this injustice happen in my face. I am going to use my whiteness against this white supremacy that I'm seeing. Now, she probably didn't have it in those terms in her head, but she had it in her heart. That's what I call appropriate whiteness, where you use the protection of a white identity to actively work against white supremacy, the ideology. And I think all of us can do that. All of us can do that. And so that's what I teach in my classes, how to do that. And talk about the suppression of the history of whites who've done it in the past. I mean, there was a whole white movement against slavery that most of us don't even know about, for example. So there's never been an uncontested white supremacy. There's always been resistance, but so much of the story of Black people was told from the perspective of what was done to us and not what we did for ourselves. And from the perspective of white people, it's told what was done in their names and not how they resisted. Ella?
Hi, I just kind of wanted to know your opinion on like Clarence Thomas and like his impact on the Supreme Court and like just the Supreme Court's like unbalance right now with their conservative views and how that's really affecting our country.
I support Elizabeth Warren's plan to expand the Supreme Court, frankly, because that's not set in gold. And I have a dream, as what somebody famous once said. I have a dream, and I have a dream that Joe Biden appoints Barack Obama to the Supreme Court. You know, I really, really think that that's the only way we're gonna uh, uh, address Leo Leonard, whoever that guy's name is, putting all that billions in it. Is it Leo Leonard? Did I get the name right? Yeah. And his deformation of our justice system, because these white supremacists masquerading as Republicans, they don't care about these cultural issues. You cannot convince me that they care about these cultural issues, except how they can animate their base to allow them to do judicial appointments that will protect them from prosecution for their corruption. That's Trump's goal. That's McConnell's goal. They don't want to go to jail for the corruption that is hidden in plain sight. But they're using the cultural wars to get that protection. And so I support Elizabeth Warren's plan. Let's expand the damn Supreme Court and do it fast. But I'm surprised at the weakness and the timidity of the Democratic Party. Well, I shouldn't be surprised because they've always been weak and timid. Yeah. And because they got so badly bitten once Johnson did the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, and they drove all the white Democrats into the Republican Party, that they've been gun shy on standing up for justice ever since, damn near. But it's interesting how the abortion decision has finally gotten them to understand, wait, y'all got winning issues here if you take it to the people and stop being afraid. Leonard Leo, thank you. And stop being afraid of don't be afraid of your voters the same way the Republicans are afraid of their voters, right? So we have that going on as well. Anybody else? Ivania?
Okay, thank you for the pronunciation. We appreciate it. My question, I was trying to work it out. That's why I put my hand down. But what you're, this thing that I've been mulling over is thinking about how to get people into action and getting people into action, because you're bringing up all these examples of like appropriate whiteness and how people engage in that. But and like with the Democrats and their weakness and like not willing to go full gung ho on the other side is this issue of power, right? Like people in leadership positions are there because they want power, and it's about how to hold on to the power they have and expand their power. And they're only willing to fight for things that'll get us towards equality or equity or improve our stance if they can hold on to what they perceive as power. So my question for you is, in thinking about that, how do we get people to not see things in that false binary of where they want to hold on to the old because they have some power in it, they have some privileges in it, and get past that and see that, you know, helping, like we don't all do better until we all do better. Like,
Right.
what are some suggestions there? Because I know you don't have like the whole answer, because if you did, then you know other people would and we would be there. But like, how could we be taking steps to get people to stop that, you know, scarcity thinking and mindset and get into something different, something better?
Well, that's actually the topic of the last decade of work that I've been doing, calling in the calling out culture. Because I don't no longer focus on issues, I focus more on process. Because to stop the human rights violations that we're experiencing, we're going to need power. You can't do that from a disempowered position. But we need to have serious conversations about the appropriate use of power and appropriate ways to acquire power. And that's kind of hard coming from the feminist movement because we're afraid of hierarchy. We're afraid of power because hierarchy and power is so frequently used against us. But we've got to stop being nervous Nellies around power. I mean, these people, are not going to give up without us having the power to overwhelm them. And that's why I think that calling in practices are so important, because we not only need the power of the people who think like us, but we need the power of the people who agree to be with us, even if they think something radically different, because they may be coming at issues from a totally different way. But if they agree to help us get the power to address these human rights violations that are taking place, I'm okay with that, because I don't need people to agree with me to be with me. I just need you to understand that we can work on building a shared world where everybody's voices and opinions matter and can be included, as long as your voices, opinions do not lead to the destruction of somebody else. Like, people say, well, wait a minute, Loretta, you trying to call in Nazis? I said, not a bit. I have a different strategy for Nazis. But for everybody to the left of the Nazis, I'm gonna figure out how I need to sophisticate my organizing skills to bring you in. Because if you're not on the extreme right, you're either a proven ally, somebody I know I can ride and die with, a potential ally, because you put up that Black Lives Matter sign, and that may be all I know about you, but I already know the number one thing I need to know. Ain't nobody in the Klan ever put up a Black Lives Matter sign. Ever. Right? No homophobe ever run, displayed a rainbow flag. So that means you're a potential ally, and I need to figure out how to work with you. Or you're a problematic ally, which is, I consider, the entirety of the feminist movement as far as I'm concerned. And that means we don't think alike, but we are equally committed to ending patriarchy because we're moving in the same direction, even as we embrace different strategies to get there. So if my allies are proven, potential, or problematic, it's on me to lift my game, not for them to change to meet me, if I consider myself a sophisticated organizer. But some people organize as if they're building cults instead of a movement for power. If you don't perfectly align with me, if you don't use this word the way I think you should use it, if you don't do this, if you don't do that, then, I don't think you have a correct analysis. And I'm like, please get over yourself. Because we're not building a cult, we're building a human rights movement. And many times I keep telling people, instead of getting a keyboard, why don't you get a therapist? Because some of the shit you're bringing to the movement needs some professional help. Our purpose in the human rights movement is to end oppression, not to make you feel good about yourself. Even though that will happen when you do the work, but still, that's not the purpose of the movement, to make you feel safe, to make you feel unchallenged, to make you feel like you're all right the way you are. No, the purpose of the movement is to help you grow into the privilege that you have.
Well, I have a question, just expanding on that point, Loretta, I want to just ask you, when you teach students about using appropriate whiteness, right? How do you talk to students who are afraid of using their whiteness appropriately, who are afraid of speaking up because they're afraid of making mistakes? They're afraid of being uncomfortable and saying the wrong thing. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, that's it. By the way, I teach calling in techniques online. My last class for the year is tomorrow at 7 o'clock Eastern time, and it's cost all of $5 if you'd like to join it. So you can get this pretty easily from me. Go to my website and register. But I teach calling in techniques based on teaching people that everybody makes mistakes. It's only human to make mistakes. The question is, can you do things perfectly? The real question is, do you handle your mistakes like a child or an adult? You know, because a child denies they made a mistake, denies the harm that the mistake has caused, and doesn't make a plan to do better in the future. But an adult acknowledges their mistakes, apologizes for the harm they've done, and they plan to do better in the future. So I don't expect people to not make mistakes. I expect them to treat them like grown-ups and not children. It's childish to expect that you're going to live in this world without making a mistake and not being harmed or causing harm. That's an impossible standard. It is not real. And I'm scared all the time. Hell, I've been shot at in Mississippi. I've been a Black person going to Klan rally. Being scared ain't never stopped nothing from that needed to be done. Fear is not a rationale for not doing the right thing. I like to make decisions that I can look in the eye without shame. And I like feeling proud of me. That's my ego talking. So I'm gonna constantly try to do the right thing because I don't want to feel shamed about my choice not to do the right thing. When I don't do the right thing, I feel worse about myself. And I think most people do. They don't feel better about themselves for not doing the right thing. They feel worse. And I don't like, the world makes me feel bad enough without me contributing to it. Nancy, you gotta unmute.
Yes, of course. I did put it in chat because it took me a while to figure out where the raising hand was. But I was wanting to ask you to say a bit more about the current violent anti-democratic efforts by those on the right, because they're becoming much more explicit about their wish to end democracy so that, quote, the right people can be in charge. And while, of course, it is important to remember that coalition building is the solution, that takes time. And we may not have that much time if the right-wing movements prevail in their current efforts to undermine democracy.
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic that we'll have the time it takes, you know, because...
And could you say more about why?
Well, because the only way for them to succeed is successfully to lie to people. Let me put it in broad meta way. I think we have a winning hand. The reason I think we have a winning hand is because the people on the right think they're fighting us, the human rights movement. But they're wrong. We're fighting them, but they ain't fighting us because they're fighting the truth. Think about it. They're fighting evidence. They're fighting history. And most of all, they're fighting time. And I'm convinced that truth, evidence, time, and history can kick their ass. Because no group of men, no matter how determined they are, can defeat those existential forces. Think about it. We got truth, time, evidence, and history on our side. What we don't have is control of the timeline, which is what's scaring us. But I do believe there's an inevitability about our victory, because I don't believe I can fail. We can fail with true time evidence and history on our side.
I hope you're right.
Unless your name is H.G. Wells and you built a time machine, we got your ass. And think about it. I'm just talking in broad strokes, but think about the 2020 election. Not only did it produce Joe Biden defeating Trump, but what people have not sufficiently paid attention to, in my opinion, is how every white demographic voted for Donald Trump, as it's been consistent throughout history. The majority of white people always vote for the candidate that best represents white supremacy. That's just been as steady as, anything that you can analyze from voting patterns throughout the entirety of America. Except there was one slice of the white demographic that broke and voted 62% for Joe Biden, the 18 to 29-year-olds. That had never happened in the history of America, ever. And that by itself is like, oh, hell, we got them with our pool, we got them with our music, and now we got them at the ballot box too. Shit, these boys are in trouble because we have stolen what they have created, their own children. And when they go black, they don't go back. We got them for generations, right? And these kids are risking fights with grandma at the Thanksgiving table over gender pronouns and the people who are financing their education. They are putting a whole lot of stuff on the line to stand up for the right thing to do. So I don't ever want to underappreciate the fact that, and the Republicans know exactly what they're doing. Outside of the Black communities, you know where they're doing their most voter suppression efforts? In the voting precincts near predominantly white schools.
Yes, in universities.
Huh?
In universities.
Exactly.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. They know we've got their kids.
That's why
And
they're
it's their
trying to make it
Vietnam
illegal
War
to talk
protest
about
moment.
these issues.
Huh?
That's why they're trying to make it illegal to talk about these issues and to have kids
Exactly.
learn about them. Right.
Exactly. So I see the thing I regret is that it's not happening as fast as I would like it to, but I've been, on that vibe since I was 16 years old. I thought if I worked hard enough, the revolution would be tomorrow. 54 years later, it ain't happened that way. But still, I have nothing but the profound belief that we've got all the right forces of the universe on our side. Unfortunately, a lot of people are going to die and suffer because we're dealing with the last gasp of a dying breed, and they're more vicious. Oh, by the way, speaking of the destruction of democracy, you need to read Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains. They started
I have, and I've quoted it often.
Right, since 1954 in reaction to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and Fred Koch, Charles and David's father, decided to fund the destruction of democracy. It's there. The evidence is there. And they ain't won yet, and they ain't gonna. Okay. They have to lie to people by pretending that they want to restore democracy when in fact they want to defeat it. So they have to lie to the very people they're trying to lead. That also is a losing strategy. And
hi, yeah, thank you so much for this talk. I when you just spoke about young people, I've been sort of grappling with this idea of the sort of generation of far right female influencers on like TikTok, Instagram, like
the trad wives and all of those people.
Yeah, and just I guess there have been two understandings of if they're in it for the grift or if they're in it for like ideologically they view
or some combination.
what we see as their best interests, like they see losing that, like losing the right to vote as their true best interest. And I was just curious about your understanding of them and how, like, as a young person online, how to counteract that, how to sort of grapple with that.
Well, you ask a complicated question because there's one question of how do you get people to be skeptical of what's seen online? That's a whole nother conversation, right? But also, let's be clear, mainstream media valorizes it too. That's why 18 Kids and Counting was so popular. That's why, you're looking at Fixer to Fabulous, which is as white patriarchal a show as you've ever seen on TV, with the adopted Black kid and the American flag everywhere. I mean, they are giving us repeated messages over and over again about the idealized world that they want to make America great again with. And so I try to talk to people about how to appropriately evaluate all media, but not just social media, but even mainstream traditional media. You have to take a skeptical eye to it all. And I'm reassured because when the young people in my classes talk to me about their relationship to social media, they said we start off with the assumption that everybody's lying because we've been lied to forever on social media. So we know people are catfishing and not really what they are and stuff. It's the people who are most gullible on social media are boomers like me. The young people are not that susceptible as they are. That they are too susceptible to social anxiety, bad self-esteem, perfectionist culture. There's so much that we can talk about, but they're also decently skeptical too. And I appreciate that about them. But I keep trying to tell you, learning about politics on social media is like learning about how to have good sex by watching pornography. Wrong answer. Wrong answer every time. All right, I think we're at time. Are there any final questions? Jason?
I'm sorry to jump in last minute. I was just kind of curious. You talk a lot about like the ideology versus the identity and how like countries, and even the video you showed, the political video, talks a lot about trying to almost prove your identity. And you talked about obviously with like the white male and so much going on right now about like white fragility and just like this and identity politics and constantly using identity as something that people use either to fear you out of or to say, no, stand up for your identity. And like, I'm curious, how do you kind of push that aside and focus more on the ideology? Because so much is about like trying to put a box on things versus kind of focusing more on like how many groups truly have very similar ideologies of the way that they think and process, but people in power kind of use identity to divide while like the goals are so similar.
Well, the only way to do it is to teach. I mean, to collide identity and ideology works to serve a certain goal. But that's just like me believing that just because somebody's Black, there won't be a Candace Owens. There won't be a Clarence Thomas. Just because somebody's white doesn't mean that they're going to be recruitable by the Ku Klux Klan or the white supremacist movement. We've got to get out of what we call identity reductionism or identity essentialism, to use that academic term. Just because somebody's gay doesn't mean they're not going to be at a Trump rally. I mean, it just goes on and on. When we reduce people to identities with these expectations that because they have a certain identity, they're going to be a certain way, that's just bad analysis. It's just bad analysis. And I'm saying we can use our identities in very productive ways. Like, I know I'm gonna get in trouble with this, but it has to be my last comment because I've got to go. But I, as a Black person descendant of slaves, have understood oppression. And I am talking about why all the white folks in America are alive, because Black people did not believe that the way to free ourselves was to mass murder white people. And we could have, because we babied your children. We bathed your asses. You're still the nurses and everything else. I mean, we're in such intimate relationships with white people that if we were convinced that the murder of white people would be the pathway to liberation, most of y'all would not be around. And that's because it ain't us. It ain't the philosophical, atavistic beliefs that we brought with us from Africa about how liberation, a war for liberation is conducted. But I'm not trying to oversimplify or over-romanticize, but just recognize the naked reality that we have always been in such intimate relationship with white people that if it was our strategy to eliminate white people, y'all been long gone. Because we don't believe that's the strategy for liberation. We have never believed that. And I hope the world lets us witness what we think does work, because that's the way we're going to get free in the way we've gotten free so far. Not vengeance, not violence, but another way of seeing the world. Because we I'll just put it simply. If we believe life is originated in Africa, then everybody on the planet is a cousin. And we have to act that way. That's kind of how you gotta act, Just because they made up these artificial categories, that don't make you any less cuz. And that's how you have to see the world. That's how I see it. And it's very Ubuntu for us to see the world that way.
Thank you, Cousin Loretta.
I love it.
This has
that
been
word
wonderful.
cuz is like just like with Lola LaDuke, all my relations. I mean, it's just a different way of seeing the world and your relationship to every other human being on the planet. They're cousins. Much removed cousins, but cousins.
Right. Hopefully we can have a reunion again soon.
Absolutely. Hell, when we do actually have family reunions in my family, 10% of the participants are white. Yeah. People I married from my family back in the early 1920s, and I was surprised when all these white people showed up in our family reunion T-shirts. So it's what we deal with all the time. So going right along.
Well, thank you so much. I know I speak for everyone who's been able to share this time with you tonight. We appreciate your time, your graciousness, all of the knowledge you've shared with us, and your commitment and hope, which will I know stay with each one of us. Thank you so much.
I'm having fun, so I hope that joy comes through.
Yes, it does. It does. And I want to encourage everyone to please go check out Loretta's website, her podcast, her books. There are so many amazing resources out there. So see this as just the beginning of your journey.
Again, thanks for inviting me, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Take care.